Hello, I'm Daniel Somlo and welcome to The Luxury of Time episode 2, where we're going to be discussing top 10 reasons to buy a vintage wristwatch. For this episode, you're going to be joining us from Pickett in Mayfair. In these lovely surroundings, I am here today with James Darby. He's recently joined our team and we're going to be talking you through the top 10 reasons to buy a vintage wristwatch.
First of all, thank you very much for having me, Daniel. So today we're talking about vintage watches. The first thing I wanted to know is really, why do you think people buy vintage watches for starters? And what have you got today to show us?
The first point I'd like to make is one of the reasons that a lot of people buy vintage wristwatches is to be different. I think one of the main draws to buying a vintage watch is to separate yourself from the vast majority of people who are going to be going modern or wearing a smartwatch, something like that. So the first watch that I've brought today is a Longines chronograph, but it's quite an unusual one. It's a flyback chronograph. And this isn't really like many things that are made today. There are very few watches like this. And it's solid 18 karat yellow gold, which for a tool watch is in itself quite unusual.
Yeah. So back then, would that have been specifically for as a tool watch? Or would that have been, you know, a very fancy watch back then as well?
Well, it's an interesting point because it's a little bit of both.
Right.
Somebody would have bought to use, however, it would double as a dress watch as well.
So one of my favourite things about vintage watches, I'd say, is the history behind them, right? And knowing you, I'm guessing you brought a Speedmaster with you today.
I have indeed. Wouldn't be me without one. But it's a very good point, and it's the second point that we've got. Speedmasters, or any vintage watch, one of the biggest draws of them is the histories and their importance to history. And I think a Speedmaster has one of the more famously important histories, being the only official watch to be selected by NASA to go to the moon. And this one that I've got here is 105012, and it would have been the reference that Buzz Aldrin would have worn when he landed on the moon.
Wow.
A lot of these things predate electronic measuring equipment and things like that. So these were originally important pieces of equipment for people to use. The Speedmaster, before it was anything to do with the moon landings, was actually aimed at race drivers, and they would use it to time.
So what year did they come out then?
The first Speedmaster came out in 1957, and the whole sort of concept of a tool watch was kind of popular around the 50s. That was when these things sort of became established.
So if I'm correct, NASA asked various companies to submit a watch to go on their spacecraft to the moon, right? And the Speedmaster was the only one to pass the test.
Yeah, absolutely. They asked several companies to submit designs, and a few companies sent watches back to them, and the Speedmaster was the only one that actually passed all of the tests. The third thing is about the actual quality of materials and things used back when vintage watches were being made. You find that older metals tended to stand up better, and a lot of these companies didn't have the reputations that they have today. The companies used to have something to prove, and now they kind of, a lot of the time, they rely on their reputations.
Back then, people had a certain expectation, you know, when they were paying that kind of money for a product, right?
Absolutely, and the company had to justify that.
Another thing I absolutely love about vintage watches is you can see all the different art movements and all the different styles. This 1920s Patek is a really great example of kind of like surrealist experimentation, you know, watches meeting art. It's got lovely patina on it, it's got an explosion dial. I absolutely love it, and it just feels so 20s.
It's watches like this that actually inspired later watch designers. This one in particular inspired Frank Muller to come up with his sort of crazy dial designs, because he originally worked for Patek.
And how many of these would you say are around today?
Very, very few would have survived, especially in original condition. Point number 5 is availability. You can actually buy vintage wristwatches, which sounds a little bit ridiculous, but I'm sure many people who are watch collectors will know when you walk into many of the big watch brands today and you want to buy one of their products, you will not be eligible unless you've bought however much, whatever they want you to buy. And you can't really make a watch video or make too many watch videos without mentioning the R word, Rolex. So what I've got here to show today is a Rolex Oyster Perpetual, but from the 1950s. We have this in our shop. You can walk in and buy it. Whereas for many modern watches, there is a big barrier to a lot of people who would be very interested in buying it, because they direct you to several other watches that you need to fulfill. You can register your interest for one and maybe they will find you one. So the next big point is something that loads of people who collect vintage wristwatches swear by, and it's the thrill of the hunt. It's finding the watch that you're looking for, finding the particular dial configuration, hands, case, reference number. There is so much variety in vintage wristwatches that finding the one that's right for you can be a really enjoyable experience and quite fulfilling as well. The next big point to mention about vintage wristwatch buying and collecting is the variety of options that you have available. And when people are confined by modern watch catalogues, which have very few options or only a couple of models, this may be something interesting to explore.
So here you've got two lovely examples of the variety you can get when collecting vintage, right? So you've got, you know, a square-faced watch from the 1950s, also known as a carré, and then you've got a Genève from the 1970s with a sunburst blue dial.
So this one was known as the Cosmic, wasn't it? They're quite collectible at the moment, and there's really nothing in the current collections that's anything like that. Similarly with the blue dial, as you said, it was quite an unusual thing.
And the other thing I love about vintage watches is, you know, sometimes the patina makes them look absolutely beautiful. I mean, on this old Cosmic here, you've got oxidization, which means it's been in a safe. Am I correct, Daniel?
Yeah, it's been left and sort of untouched and unpolished, if you like.
Another thing I really like about working in the watch industry is the relationship we have with our customers and the relationship they have with the dealers.
With a lot of modern watches, you build a relationship with an authorized dealer by purchasing certain things that they require you to purchase, or certain things that they have to justify getting you what you sort of want. Whereas with vintage watches, the relationship that you build with your dealer is you go in and you buy the things that you want and you show an interest in the things that you want, and then your dealer helps to guide you to other things that you may be interested in. And it's kind of an opposite relationship.
No, you don't need to justify yourself or...
Absolutely, you can buy what you like and you can be shown things that you'd be interested in rather than having to fulfill a quota or earning your place. So the second to last point is a contentious one, and it's price. Broadly speaking, vintage watches are cheaper than their modern counterparts, or you at least get more for your money. So this example here is an 18-karat rose gold Constellation chronometer automatic wristwatch. It's an iconic watch, and the case of this watch was designed by Gerald Genter, who's one of the most famous watch designers to ever live. And this watch is a few £1,000s from a good dealer with service and extract from the archives and guaranteed. Whereas if you wanted the modern equivalent of this, which would be a solid gold Constellation on a strap, you'd be spending just under £20,000.
It's ridiculous.
And I mean, in my somewhat biased opinion, I do prefer the style of the older ones. But I think that you do often get more for your money with that respect. It's not always true with some of the steel sports watches, but that's a different kettle of fish. So the last point, and for a lot of people with vintage watches, it's probably the most important, and it's the community. There are big communities of people who swear by and love vintage watches, and there are thousands of forums dedicated to them. There are groups that you can join where people come together and discuss their watches, and most of the information that's available to collectors, to dealers, to even to auction houses and big establishments that's all been collated by the community of vintage watch collectors.
And I find the vintage community very much talk and focus on the history behind the watch, whether the watch has been messed with, you know, how iconic it is. And I feel like a lot of people in the contemporary watch world, it's very focused on the price point.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. It's the price point and the availability. Whereas with older watches, there's a lot more discussion that can be had. You can talk condition, you can talk age, you can talk history. And, you know, there are nerdier points and there are more fun, interesting, aesthetic points. Some people collect them because they just love the look and they talk about the look and, you know, how gorgeous this watch is, how lovely that one is. Other people, was this part meant to be in that reference? And it's an emotional and sentimental aspect of watch collecting.
So those are our top 10 reasons why we believe you should look into buying a vintage wristwatch. Thank you very much for listening. I'm James Darby.
And I'm Daniel Somlo, and we'd like to send a special thank you to Trevor Pickett for hosting us this evening and providing us with this beautiful leather travel tray. I hope you've enjoyed the second episode of The Luxury of Time, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.